You've asked us to dive into a what-if scenario, and a kind of scary one. What if Israel attacks Iran? What happens next?
Yeah, it's definitely unsettling to think about.
Yeah. So we're going to dive into all the potential fallout. What could Iran do? Let's be honest, it's a bit unnerving, right?
It really is. I mean, this
Yeah.
tension has been building for decades,
Yeah.
mainly over Iran's nuclear program. And it's led to, well, a very delicate situation.
Right.
And you have to factor in Israel's commitment to preventing Iran from obtaining nuclear weapons.
Mhm.
So it adds another layer of, well, complexity.
Oh, totally. It feels like one wrong move could set off a chain reaction
Yeah.
across the entire region, maybe even the world. So we're
Oh,
going to look at possible military responses, diplomatic strategies, even cyber warfare,
right.
but of course, all in this fictional scenario.
Right, exactly. And it's really important to remember that this is, a hypothetical situation. We're exploring possibilities,
Yeah.
not predicting the future.
Right. Of course. Yeah.
But even in a fictional scenario, Iran's potential responses,
Yeah.
I mean, they're multifaceted. They have a very complex military, uh, lots of different moving parts.
Yeah. I was reading about Iran's ballistic missiles,
Right.
and some can even reach Israel. And then there are the proxy groups like Hezbollah in Lebanon. Could Iran use them to strike back?
Yeah, it's certainly possible. These groups are essentially armed and funded by Iran. They act as like extensions of their military power. Think of it like a chessboard.
Okay.
Iran could make strategic moves using these pieces scattered across the region.
Mm-hmm.
So they could launch direct missile attacks on, Israeli soil, or they could orchestrate these attacks through their proxies.
So that kind of brings up another question. Would Iran try to keep things contained, or would they go for all-out war?
I mean, that's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
A full-blown war carries immense risks for everyone involved, including the potential for drawing in the United States.
Right.
So, you know, Iran might opt for a more calculated approach. They could use limited targeted strikes just to send a message, but not to trigger a wider conflict.
So like hitting specific military targets
Yeah.
as opposed to, civilian areas.
Exactly. They would want to demonstrate strength and resolve, but without crossing the line into like an all-out war. But even those limited strikes, they could have unpredictable consequences, especially given how volatile that region is.
Yeah, for sure. So it sounds like Iran would be trying to walk a tightrope,
Yeah,
retaliate forcefully, but avoid a catastrophic escalation.
and that's just, the military side of things.
Yeah.
We also have to consider the diplomatic arena. Iran could use this hypothetical attack to gather international support and maybe even portray themselves as the victim.
Okay, so let's unpack that a little. What kind of diplomatic maneuvers could we see?
Well, Iran could use platforms like the United Nations to condemn the attack, right?
Mhm.
And to rally support from countries who are sympathetic to their cause. They could highlight the violation of their sovereignty.
Yeah. Potentially even frame it as an act of war and use that narrative to bolster their position on the world stage.
They do have some powerful allies, too.
Yes.
Russia and China come to mind.
Exactly. And those relationships could be crucial in this scenario.
Yeah.
Both of those countries have been critical of Western intervention in the Middle East, and they've historically supported Iran's right to develop nuclear technology, for peaceful purposes, of course. So they could use their influence at the UN to shield Iran from further sanctions or, international condemnation.
So even if Iran didn't launch a full-scale military response, they could still put pressure on Israel
Right?
through diplomacy and these international alliances. It really highlights, how interconnected global politics really are.
Absolutely. And we haven't even touched on the potential for cyber warfare, which adds another, whole layer of complexity.
That's right, yeah. We can't forget about that.
Mhm.
Iran has invested heavily in its cyber capabilities.
Oh, yeah. And I've read some pretty unsettling reports about their ability to disrupt critical infrastructure.
Those reports are definitely cause for concern.
Yeah.
Imagine a scenario where Iran retaliates by targeting Israel's power grid,
Yeah.
shutting down electricity for millions of people, or crippling their banking system and bringing the entire economy to a standstill.
I mean, that's a chilling thought.
Right.
It's a reminder that cyber warfare isn't just about, stealing data. It can have real-world physical consequences.
Oh, absolutely. And let's not forget about the impact on the global economy.
Hmm.
I mean, Iran could disrupt global oil supplies by targeting tankers in the Strait of Hormuz, which would send shockwaves through the global energy markets, potentially trigger a global recession.
Wow, that's a lot to take in. Just
Yeah.
thinking about all of these possibilities really makes you realize, like, the stakes are incredibly high.
Yeah.
And we've only just scratched the surface of what Iran might do.
You're absolutely right. I mean, it's crucial to remember that these are just some of the possibilities. The actual response, in a real-world scenario would depend on countless factors, things we can't really predict.
Right.
But even exploring these hypothetical scenarios, I think, gives us valuable insight into the complex web of all these geopolitical relationships
Oh,
and the potential consequences of a conflict in that region.
totally.
It's fascinating. Each of those responses, those potential responses, has its own set of risks and rewards for Iran.
Yeah, that's what's so interesting about this whole hypothetical, right? Like, Iran's leadership, they're playing this high-stakes strategy game,
Yeah.
trying to anticipate Israel's moves and how to counter them effectively.
Exactly, like launching a massive retaliatory strike.
Right.
That might seem like, the most decisive option,
Right.
but it could easily backfire,
Yeah.
escalate the conflict beyond their control.
Right, they could end up in a wider regional war,
Yeah.
which could then, drag in other major powers, like the U.S. And we can't forget about, the humanitarian cost of a conflict like that.
Absolutely. And we can't forget about the impact on the Iranian people.
Hmm.
A full-blown war. And that
Right.
would undoubtedly lead to economic hardship, political instability, and loss of life.
So even if a large-scale attack is an option, it might not be the smartest choice.
Right.
Are there any, like, historical examples that could shed light on how they might approach this?
Well, if we look back at the tanker war in the 80s,
Hmm.
we see how Iran used this mix of conventional and unconventional tactics.
Okay.
They attacked oil tankers in the Persian Gulf,
Mhm.
disrupted global shipping, but they also engaged in diplomacy, trying to get international support and isolate Iraq, who they were at war with.
So even in a conflict, they didn't just, like, pick one strategy. They
Right.
did a little bit of everything,
Yeah.
combining the military action with diplomatic maneuvers.
Exactly. And that might be a good lesson for them in this situation.
Right.
Instead of just one overwhelming response, they might pick something more nuanced, a combination of limited military strikes, some targeted cyber attacks, and then, a diplomatic effort to, paint themselves as the victim.
Okay, that makes sense. It let them apply pressure on different fronts while also lowering the risks of an all-out war.
Yeah,
But that would be a tough balancing act.
absolutely.
Okay.
Iran would have to, really carefully calibrate their response, avoiding anything that would provoke a big retaliation from Israel or, alienate their allies on the world stage.
Okay. So with all of this, what does it mean for, the average person? Why should we care about this hypothetical scenario in a region that feels so far away?
That's a great question. And the answer is, these events, even if they are hypothetical, they have the potential to impact everyone.
How so?
Well, we've talked about, global economic disruption if Iran decides to hit oil tankers, messing with shipping lanes. That would lead to higher gas prices, higher prices for everything from groceries to, I don't know, anything, really.
Right, and those price increases would be felt all over the world, not just in the Middle East.
Exactly. And beyond the economic part, there's also the global security issue. A wider conflict in the Middle East could destabilize the entire region, create a breeding ground for, terrorism and extremism, which could have huge consequences.
Yeah, it's a reminder that everything is connected and events in one part of the world can impact everyone. But it's hard to keep up with all the complexities of, international relations.
I get that it can be overwhelming, but that's why it's so important to engage with these issues, even if it's just through, thought experiments like this.
So by exploring these what ifs, we're not just speculating, we're actually understanding the forces that shape the world.
Precisely. And hopefully that understanding can lead to, better discussions, smarter decisions, and ultimately, a more peaceful world.
I like that. So where do we go from here? We've talked about Iran's potential military responses, their diplomatic options, the whole cyber dimension. What else should we consider?
There's one angle we haven't really discussed yet. What if Iran speeds up their nuclear program as a response to an attack?
Ooh, that's an interesting twist. I hadn't thought about that.
It is controversial, but we can't ignore it. Some experts believe an attack on Iran's nuclear facilities could backfire, push them to actually pursue nuclear weapons even more aggressively.
So instead of, deterring them, an attack would actually make them double down on their ambitions.
Yeah, exactly. It's a complex issue with good arguments on both sides, but it's definitely worth thinking about as we, look at the potential fallout of this whole scenario.
This is why I love these deep dives. Always something new to think about. It's like peeling back the layers of an onion. Every layer is more and more complex.
That's a great analogy. It really highlights how important it is to approach these issues with an open mind and to consider different points of view.
Yeah, it really is. It just makes you think about how everything's connected.
Right.
And one event can set off, like this whole chain reaction.
Absolutely.
But this new twist, right, with Iran maybe speeding up their nuclear program, that kind of changes everything.
It does. It adds a whole other level of complexity to the situation.
Yeah.
Imagine the global response. Countries that didn't want to get involved before, they might feel like they have to do something. If they think Iran's about to get nukes.
Right, because then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah.
Israel attacks Iran to stop them from getting nukes, but the attack itself is what makes Iran want them even more.
Exactly. A real catch-22.
Hmm.
And this is where things get really, really interesting. Remember, we've been looking at Iran's possible responses in isolation, but their actions will be affected by so many outside
Oh
factors.
yeah, for sure. Like what? Give me an example.
Okay, well, think about the United States. What would they do?
Okay.
Would they back Israel? Or would they try to calm things down through diplomacy? Whatever they do, it can change everything.
That's true. And what about the other countries in the region?
Right.
Like Saudi Arabia, they have their own relationships with both Iran and Israel. How they react could really change
It's
things.
like this giant complicated web. Each thread is like a different country, a different relationship, a different goal. And when you pull on one thread, the whole thing moves.
Right, which makes it almost impossible to predict what would actually happen if Israel attacked Iran.
Yeah. There are just too many moving pieces, too many things we can't know for sure.
Too many variables. So even though we can't say for sure what would happen, we can still learn from thinking about it.
Absolutely. By considering all the options, military, diplomatic, economic, even nuclear, we get a better understanding of how things work, the motivations of each side, and what a conflict could actually lead to.
It's like we've been on this journey exploring all these different paths, different what ifs, and it all started with this one hypothetical event.
Exactly, and I hope this has given you a sense of just how complicated the world is, how important it is to think critically, and to really consider all sides of the story, especially with these sensitive topics.
I know it has for me. So to wrap things up, what's the one thing you want our listeners to take away from this deep dive?
If I had to pick one thing, it would be to, embrace the uncertainty. The world is unpredictable, and that's okay. Don't be afraid to ask tough questions. Challenge what you think you know, and look at things from different angles.
That's great advice. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive. Thanks for joining us on this exploration of all the what ifs and consequences. Remember, even thinking about hypotheticals can teach us a lot about the real world.